One of the things the Dolphins got most wrong in 2024 was their backup quarterback situation. What are their options this year to make the situation right? We're looking at that here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a welcome and thank you to our everydayers because it is your team every day here on the Locked On Network, even when your season is over, as it is for the Dolphins. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. We're going to need more than $5 to get a legitimate backup quarterback on the scene here for the Dolphins. And it was part of the problem that the team had last year. Chris Grier admitted vocally at the end of season press conference as such that the team was interested in a number of veteran backup quarterbacks and finished as the also ran or the runner-up in the sweepstakes for some of those players because the team was gaming the compensatory pick formula to try to take advantage of the departures of players that they couldn't afford. And Rob Hunt, who signed a $100 million contract, and Christian Wilkins, who signed a $110 million contract. And, or whatever the astronomical amount that Christian Wilkins signed for was. But where that left the Dolphins is we can't spend above a certain budget amount or else risk losing what could have potentially been 2 third-round picks that the NFL would give back to Miami for losing net free agents and big-name free agents, and that's how the compensatory formula works. We did a whole show on that way back last March when it was relevant to the Dolphins' free agency plans, and you kind of saw it materialize, but it was still nice to hear them say that part out loud. That, yes, we made personnel decisions based largely on this formula for competitive balance and player personnel and the free agency era, where if teams lose significant amounts and do not replace them on the open market and free agency, they are compensated in the way of additional draft picks, and it's tiered by how much the player gets paid. So with those in mind, Miami really found themselves handcuffed, and the players that they went out of their way to sign in free agency were names like Jordan Brooks and Aaron Brewer, and those names canceled out free agent losses like Brandon Jones, right? But you could tell they were always very deliberate to not sign more than, what would have them at net -2 in the free agents for players that qualify for the formula. And then we know how that story ends because the season comes and Tua tries to run Damar Hamlin over and is concussed and goes on IR per the recommendation of the medical professionals as a result of that. And Skylar Thompson is an abject disaster in his first start, so much so that he doesn't process being hot off a linebacker blitz and has some kind of abdomen injury that knocks him out of the game. And then you're down to Tim Boyle, and then you start Tyler Huntley, and Tyler Huntley goes for a stretch, and then he gets hurt in the second half against the Colts, and Tim Boyle comes back in, and then Tua comes back, and then Tua takes the hit against the Texans, and then he gets it aggravated against the 49ers, and then we're back to Tyler Huntley. And mercifully, the only stretch that we saw of Skylar Thompson in that stretch was in garbage time in the fourth quarter of a game in which we muffed a handoff that was returned for a touchdown. Yeah. So needless to say, complacency in that spot. Gotcha. And they subscribed to the school of thought of Tom Moore. If our starter goes down, we're you-know-what anyway. And they were you-know-what. And that's how you end up 8-9. And that's not to say that if Tua hadn't gotten hurt, that the fundamental flaws that are underlying issues with the foundation of how this team is built would not exist. And I'd like to think we would still have the awareness to talk about them. but that does significantly compound the challenge. The good news for Miami is this. The Dolphins are going to have more salary cap space available at their disposal. They're starting, they just submitted their rollover cap according to overthecap.com. They're going to roll $3 million in cap space over from 2024 to 2025. They're with their restructure potential, even with the big contracts, they're the ones we talked about yesterday that we don't know the best pathway forward with based on player decisions and if the team wants to retain the talent or how much the team wants to restructure a player's salary or do they want to post June 1st, Bradley Chubb, all that stuff. We did that yesterday. You're still starting about $30 million less in the red. You're probably going to be just break even before you touch any contracts to restructure. And this is a normal part of every team across the league does this to varying degrees based on what their team life cycle is. And the Dolphins have gone through effectively a full life cycle as an NFL franchise. And now they're a team that's in transition and they need to start, preparing for a youth movement, but they want to compete through a youth movement. So it makes threading the needle. It all just depends on the strategy that you choose to implement when you go through free agency. But they're going to not be so far in the red that we're going to restructure our contracts and hold out because we know we have to give out a few big contracts, but we don't know what those are going to look like. So we really can't empty the most of our restructure potential. That's not really in the cards for Miami this year. And they're less in debt to the cap and what the cap is scheduled to be. I actually think they may start above the cap threshold when it's all said and done. And then there's fat that you can trim off the roster. So the financial restrictions that existed for this team last year in trying to be in the hunt for a legitimate backup quarterback should not exist this time around. That's good news. Because whether you go with a player like an Andy Dalton or a Zach Wilson, Andy Dalton played for $5 million this past year for Carolina. Drew Lock played for $5 million. Joe Flacco paid for $4.5 million. Jameis Winston played for $4 million. Jimmy Garoppolo signed for $3 million. This is kind of the ballpark you're talking. Marcus Mariota was $6 million. Jacoby Brissett with an intent to start signed for $8 million to start the year. You're looking at $5 to $8 million. And the good news is I can tell you right now, you can cut Raheem Mostert and Durham Smythe off your books this offseason and open up more than $5.5 million in cap space. Like those two moves, to me, are no-brainers. And I don't want to do the whole offseason blueprint before we do the whole offseason blueprint. I got about 2 months to put it together. But you're going to get like the thought process in individual personnel decisions. We're going to tackle them one-on-one so that way we can piece all of it together to do the blueprint, which is the full mock offseason, right? But just from a financial standpoint, be mentally prepared for this player to cost over $5 million per season to be the backup quarterback. And as we said, that is not a restrictive number for the Dolphins this year, where if it were last year, it would have been a restricted number based off the team's effort to collect more draft capital via the systems in place in the free agency era of the NFL. But there's not just free agents available, and there's some interesting ones. Some I feel significantly stronger than others. There's also a draft that looms ahead, and that was something that Chris Greer also mentioned. And that's the one, I think, the one silver lining, for better or for worse, for a decision to keep the primary decision makers in place. You have enough information to understand how this group is likely going to think, how they're likely going to try to solve some problems on the roster. Now, you can have all the doubts you want or have in the world about how effective those problem-solving measures are going to be, but I could tell you this with absolute certainty. The last 2 years for this football team, the number one pain point that the team has had, the team has gone above and beyond to overcorrect for. In 2022, it was corners, right? Byron Jones ghosts you for the season. Xavier Howard gets banged up. Or that was 2023. 2022, Byron Jones goes to you. This past year, it was the edge room. By the end of the season for the playoff game, Bradley Chubb was out. Jalen Phillips was out. You were down to like Melvin Ingram and Justin Houston and a who's who of guys that were really good pass rushers 10 years ago, were the guys that were taking snaps for you in the end stretch in the playoff environment. So corner 2 years ago with the team bringing in Jalen Ramsey and drafting Cam Smith, the team was very aggressive to attack that weakness from the previous year where they ran out of gas at that spot. 2023 was the edge rush room, and they drafted Shop Robinson, and they brought in Shaq Barrett, which turned into Emmanuel Agba coming back and re-upping, even though it felt like he was done because the scheme wasn't a good fit the previous year. They drafted Muhammad Kamara, so they double-dipped in the draft. They bring in Tyus Bowser with scheme familiarity, so they will attack things that sunk the previous season with extra gusto. And backup quarterback is one of those spots this year. So we could expect some heavy investments in this spot. Well, look at the draft and the dynamics of this draft class, which are in a lot of ways unenviable. And we'll get into that next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you guys stick with us. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes now that it's the new year? Well, now it can be a thing of the past. Taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with TurboTax experts who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering whether you're missing out on deductions, whether you've got one form or 20. TurboTax experts gives your taxes their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on what really matters. You don't have to lift a finger, but you get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. It is playoff time. The NFL playoff games this weekend, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football. That's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want the chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. Prize Picks, you pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money. You can make the most of your picks in 60 seconds or less, whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or want your cash out quickly. Prize Picks has you covered with over 10 million members and billions in winnings. It's clear that the people love Prize Picks. Here's a special offer for our Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today. Use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Download the app today. Prize Picks. Use code Locked On NFL. Get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. The good news is the Dolphins appear primed to have the most draft capital they've had since maybe 2020, really, when it's all said and done. If you added up like the trade value chart value of all the draft picks that the Dolphins are currently going to have, because they are currently expected to have their own first-round pick, their own second-round pick, a compensatory 3 for Rob Hunt, Christian Wilkins based off the fine print for play time in the compensatory formula, is going to qualify as a 4th-round pick because he gets 0 points for playing time, even though he played 22% of the snaps. If you got credit for those 22%, he'd be a 3rd-round compensatory pick. But if you don't surpass 25%, you get 0 points no matter what, whether you play 24% of snaps or 0% of snaps. So that bit the Dolphins in the rear end a little bit. So they're going to have their own 4 and then expected to have a comp 4 for Christian Wilkins. And then they have 2 5s. One is their own. The other is from the Bradley Chubb trade at the deadline a couple years ago. And then they're currently scheduled to have 3 7s, their own, one from a prior trade, and then a compensatory 7 for Deshaun Elliott leaving in free agency. But wait, I feel like it's Billy Mays. But wait, there's more. News coming out today, courtesy, I believe Diana Rossini was first on this. Reggie McKenzie, who's been serving as an executive within the Dolphins front office for several seasons after 6 years as the GM of the Las Vegas Raiders in the 2010s, is interviewing with the Tennessee Titans for their GM position. And if, based off the current league-wide initiatives for diversity hiring, they incentivize teams, and there's a whole can of worms about incentivizing teams with draft picks to making hires, where I think if you really wanted to attack the roots of the lack of diversity representation, you really need to have more voices higher up within these organizations from top to bottom. But the way that the rules are currently set up, if you have a candidate who is of a minority background, who's been with your team for more than 2 seasons or more, and they leave to take a lead job somewhere else, whether that's a GM position or a head coach position, the team that previously hired that candidate who takes the job is given 2 compensatory third-round picks courtesy of the league. And that is meant to be a part of the incentivization process for teams to help groom and create a better pipeline for underrepresented peoples within football operations. Well, Reggie McKenzie would qualify for that. And Reggie McKenzie, Chad Brinker is now the lead executive in Tennessee. They kind of it feels like they kind of ran a coup on Rand Carthon, who was previously the GM there. But Reggie McKenzie has a previous working relationship with Chad Brinker, and Diana Rossini said that Reggie is good, has a lot of support within the building and may be considered the favorite to land that position. So if Reggie McKenzie gets hired as the GM of the Titans, the Dolphins will get an additional third-round compensatory pick at the end of the third round in 2025, and then another one at the end of the third round in 2026. So you're potentially looking at the Dolphins having as much as a 1, a 2, 2 3s, 2 4s, 2 5s, and 3 7s. If the compensatory picks go as planned and Reggie McKenzie gets hired, as Diana Rossini reported he's the favorite to be, by the Titans as their GM. That's the good news from a draft capital perspective. The bad news from a draft capital perspective is this draft class of quarterbacks is not great. I'm going to be completely honest. I do not love this draft class, and you have Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. Some combination of those two are generally perceived to be the top of the charts. And there's a bunch of quarterback-hungry teams. Deshaun Watson re-ruptured his Achilles, so the Browns picking at 2 might be a quarterback spot. The Giants are an obvious quarterback spot after they cut Daniel Jones in season. Tennessee gave the keys to the car to Will Levis, and he promptly crashed and burned. So they're favored to take a quarterback at number 1. The veteran free agent market could potentially impact these teams, but you kind of be surprised if they influenced all of them. So you don't expect those top 2 to be represented outside probably the top 5. And the Raiders really feels like the floor because they don't have anybody on that room right now. Behind those 2, who are perceived to be the first round guys, Carson Beck is going back to school and transferring. He's probably going to end up at the University of Miami. This is one of the perks of dating one of the Cavender twins, right? And then you have Drew Aller, who did not perform well at Hard Rock Stadium last night for Penn State in the Orange Bowl. Leaves you with Jalen Milroe from Alabama, who's declared. It leaves you potentially with Quinn Ewers, Jackson Dart, Dylan Gabriel, Kyle McCord, Curtis Rourke, who's 25 with a torn Achilles, and Quinn Ewers has had durability issues for his entire time that he's been at Texas. Every year he's gotten hurt. Milroe's super raw as a player. And if I had to kind of put him into buckets, I'd say Milroe's probably, him and Jackson Dart from a traits perspective are probably the 2 that I would guess would be day 2 picks at quarterback. And then Dylan Gabriel really struggles in the red zone from my assessment. Transferred from Oklahoma to Oregon, left-handed quarterback. People just want to see that and make that connection. and say, hey, he'd be a great backup for Tua. He's a left-handed quarterback. And in reality, I think he's very different as how he sees the field than what Tua is. He leans on his athleticism a little bit more, but he's nowhere near the anticipatory or middle of the field or tight window throw passer that Tua is. Kyle McCord's a little bit more of that, but his arm is a big limitation for who he is as a player. And the challenge for this is if you're talking about drafting a quarterback, especially if it's with a somewhat significant pick, which is what we're hoping for in order to have viable options at the backup quarterback position, how many reps are they really going to get? Well, are you going to afford Quinn Ewers the reps he needs to develop as a player before he ultimately gets thrown in the fire and asked to play? And I'm lower on Quinn than most of the names that I just mentioned, just personally for him. I think there's a process versus results thing for him that there's some negative reinforcement for things that he gets away with at Texas in a Steve Sarkisian scheme that schemes around his limitations and calls the game very differently when Arch Manning's in the game than when Quinn Ewers is in the game. So do you want to spend the second? Do you want to spend the second round pick on Jalen Milroe with Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel on hot seats and needing to win games? That's not an overly attractive option when that's a pick that you would expect can have some dividends for you and contribute to your roster next year. So then you're into Jackson Dart, and how long is he going to be around? Would you use a third-round pick for Jackson Dart? I'd feel better about it if it was in the fourth round, just honestly, because I still kind of have somewhat high expectations for third-round picks to be contributors to your team. And then you're into low-end traits guys or guys that are raw and need reps to develop. Which brings you to the other avenue that you can take. And this is the one that I think I'm going to end up championing for the Dolphins to take. There's veteran quarterbacks, guys that have been there, done that, and played. And guys like that, I think having one of those is going to make a lot of sense, whether that is a Joe Flacco or a Andy Dalton. I think Andy Dalton makes a ton of sense. A Marcus Mariota, who I'm not in love with the idea of Marcus Mariota or a Mac Jones. These aren't big-time needle-moving names to invoke. But there's another group of free agents that I think if you double-dipped at that spot and had a short-term and a long-term opportunity with veteran players that have been in the league and kind of have a bigger proof of concept and keeps your draft capital free for cost control players who can fill out the rest of your roster, it's probably going to be more appealing to me. We're going to get into that next here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure that you guys stick with us. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs is better with FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, live same-game parlays, and so much more. You can visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets at FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. As things stand currently over on FanDuel, I do like a couple of the dogs this weekend. The line has moved in favor of the Chargers even more than what it was. They're favored on the road against Houston. I like the Rams plus 2.5. That game will be played in Arizona due to the fires out in California, but that line movement has gone in favor of the Rams because of the travel there. And I just think, Sam Darnold versus the Rams, and the Rams, although they're young on defense, they got some dudes on defense, and they've got a coach and a quarterback that have been there, done that before. I kind of like the Rams plus 2.5. So that's where my action will be this weekend. Never waste a hunch, make every moment more over at FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So I want to frame this way as well. The Dolphins say they use the 48th pick for a quarterback in the second round. And I don't really like your options there, but let's just assume that they did. That total contract would have a signing bonus according to the rookie wage scale that's set by over the cap. And the draft slots are generally locked for how much money you're going to get on any given year based off the salary cap. Signing bonus of $2.75 million. And it's a 4-year contract with a total value of about $8.5 million. Okay, so $8.5 million, two and three quarter signing bonus for the 48th overall pick in the draft. You could use that on the third quarterback theoretically in this draft, and bring him in and try to get him reps, even though he's a relative unknown. My assumption would be QB3 would be Jalen Milroe, because I don't think the top two guys are going to be in the conversation for the Dolphins, even if they wanted to draft one of those as their primary hedge at the position, just because I don't think they're going to get into your stratosphere. So what that leaves you with is a second round contract and a second round pick for a player who you're going to have to find excuses to try to find reps for, knowing full well you're starting from ground zero as an NFL passer. Or you can look across the league at a couple of these guys who are gifted players, who have been in other spots. You understand what their weaknesses are. If you want to prioritize an athlete or a big-armed passer or an accurate passer, you've seen it, right? And make no mistake, I'm going to advocate for a guy like Andy Dalton as just an example of an experienced backup quarterback who's a veteran, who's been there, done that, and started a lot of games in the NFL. That's a player I would advocate for to be in the backup position. But even more than that, I'd get greedy. I would want to get greedy. And I don't know that I would want to use the draft pick for an $4-year, $8.5 million contract to bring in a complete unknown when I can sign somebody like a Trey Lance, who was a former first-round pick. He's 25 years old. He obviously did not work in San Francisco. Mike McDaniel was in San Francisco when they made that pick. His contract was 4 years, $34 million. He was traded from San Francisco to Dallas. He started the last game for Dallas this season, showcased some life, is a good athlete, can move, is young, but has had NFL coaching experience and been in multiple stops. You look at the Baker Mayfields of the world. You look at the Sam Darnolds of the world. You look at the Jared Goffs of the world. Some of these reclamation players that have been in different schemes and different stops in multiple places who underachieved early in their career. If you told me Trey Lance was signed in a modest contract that you could void year out and sign him to a 2-year deal for about the same as what the 4-year contract would be and spread it out across 4 seasons, and I don't think it does a lot of good to sign a player like this for a 1-year deal, because he's going to come in, he's going to learn your system, he may or may not ever play, and then he's going to be out having further rehabbed himself to get ready for his next opportunity to be where he gets a chance to play. You swing the bat on one of these young guys that hasn't worked out somewhere else, I would try to get it done on a multi-year contract, and that gives you more flexibility with how you navigate the cap. And reminder, whether Tyreek Hill is in Miami or not in 2025, I can tell you one place he's not going to be in 2026, and that's in Miami with his $52 million currently scheduled cap hit. And paying, especially if you pay across 2 or 3 or potentially 4 years with how you do void years, a 25-year-old quarterback on a 2 or 3 year contract, which will be very modest because he was the QB3 in Dallas and didn't play until the last game, but is 25 years old with obvious traits and showed a pulse in the season finale against Washington. Sign him on a multi-year deal so you can get him in the building and you can develop him like you would develop a rookie quarterback. I mean, he's the same age as Curtis Rourke. He's been in the league 4 years, Trey Lance. I think Zach Wilson goes in this conversation as well. Zach Wilson didn't get drafted in the top 5 because he doesn't have appealing qualities as a player. Now he was in New York and that dumpster fire, and then he ends up with Sean Payton this past year. How about Justin Fields? Well, Justin Fields is another version of that kind of player where you get a Trey Lance or a Justin Fields. You got short yardage situation problems. One of these guys, Justin Fields, is 230 pounds, 25-year-old quarterback with 4 seasons of NFL experience. Shoot, he played this past year in Pittsburgh for from a cash perspective, $3.5 million and started the first 4 or 5 games of the season for them. These are the kinds of players that I think you can make a calculated upside swing to bring in, and depending on how athletic they are, they can have a role for your team now. And I'd equate that to what Jalen Milroe could offer in the draft. Explosive, powerful, big-bodied runners. You want to have a package of plays for him that includes your short yardage stuff when you get the dreaded 3rd and 1, and it doesn't have to be the worst thing in the world like it's been for the Dolphins. And if you're going to have the candid conversation around Tua Tagovailoa, you're never going to run him because you don't want him taking unnecessary hits. And he physically does not have the profile of a 6'3", 230-pound quarterback that runs a 4.5 like a Trey Lance or a Justin Fields. Now, I think what's important to note here is I can go back to like last March when Justin Fields was on the block in Chicago, when it was apparent that they were going to draft a player. And I didn't really love the idea. And if you told me that that was going to be your answer for your QB2 spot, I still wouldn't like it because the style of play is so dramatically different. But this is talking about you, unfortunately, as the Dolphins, with the environment that you've put yourself in, with the commitments that you've made and the risks that you've chosen to take with your contracts that you've given out, you have to be more invested in this room from top to bottom, not just the guy at the top, from top to bottom, than any other team in the league. And that means you probably want 3 guys that are viable. You want a primary starter. I'd want a short-term veteran, long-in-the-tooth backup like an Andy Dalton. And then I would try to get a Trey Lance or a Justin Fields or a Zach Wilson to a lesser degree. But like, I'd still be interested in swinging the bat there if the other guys are going to price themselves out of what Miami's capable of doing. And I would aspire to have the best 1 through 3 quarterback room in the league. And if the quarterback 3 has peripheral skills as an athlete, as a runner, that you can build a package of plays around to help diversify your run game and your short yardage offense, that is where I think there's value and it makes a lot of sense. That's my 2 cents on it anyway. And again, the economics for these players is going to check in. Andy Dalton, APY was $5 million per season. Trey Lance coming off the rookie contract, it was 8.5, but he hasn't really played. I would imagine that's a guy with limited sample size. Maybe you can get on the lower end. Same thing for Justin Fields. He started more. He played 36% of Pittsburgh's offensive snaps. Doesn't seem like they're going to get him back. The challenge is the selling point of, are these guys going to want to go somewhere where they unequivocally play? And if that's the case, then you're going to have a hard time selling multiple quarterbacks to come here. But we'll see what they do. That's going to do it for us here on Locked On Dolphins with this look at the quarterback room as far as planning sufficiently for what your answers from top to bottom look like. And, I would not be surprised if you ultimately invested $8 or $10 million into backup quarterbacks, in addition to obviously the financial investments that you've made in Tua Tagovailoa. Now, if you get enough draft picks and somebody is there that makes sense at a juncture, somebody slides to you, you want to draft him, okay, great. But if it's outside, unless it's outside the first round, it's not going to be a cost control player that's any cheaper than what we're talking about anyway. So that, for me, in my frame of mind, with where this team is at, the pressure this team has to win, would not expect that to be a pathway that this team pursues. So I like my plan. And unfortunately, that will come at the expense of other positions on the roster. What all that looks like, we, of course, have a while before we figure out and piece it all together. League calendar year's a little more than 2 months away, but we will be setting the stage for all of those conversations and all of those happenings here on Locked On Dolphins. Appreciate you guys, as always, for checking out the show. Keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I'm out of here. Go Fins.